Hi there, you're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham by me, Colin Piper. And we reach, if not the end of the story, certainly the climax of the story, and even more than that, actually, a foretelling of the key moment of all history itself. It's the moment when a father is prepared to sacrifice the son he loves, and the son is prepared to trust his life to his father. On this very spot, we have one eye on the moment when Abraham puts Isaac on the altar, and another when the Father allows Jesus Christ to go to the cross. Patriarch, Chapter 7, Part 4. The place God had told him about had a peculiarly sinister feel, if not appearance. It looked strange and unsettlingly like a skull. Again, neither Abraham nor Isaac had anything to say. Rather, they got on with building an altar. Abraham had built many such altars, but never one quite like this. It looked like any other, and was like any other, except for one crucial thing: its purpose. They built slowly in their weariness and apprehension, and then even more slowly and deliberately laid the wood on top until it was finished. Finally, they stood before the altar and before one another. Each now knew the truth, and yet neither flinched. The son committed himself to the hands of the father, who bound him and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then, as he'd done many times before with sacrificial lambs, the father lifted his knife to slay his son. He closed his eyes and clenched his fist around the handle of the knife, and then he hesitated. Just long enough to take one last intake of breath, in readiness to strike as he exhaled, and yet still the son trusted his father. Despite it all, he trusted, and still the father trusted his father. Despite it all, he believed as no one in history ever had before. Was the climax of Abraham's personal journey, which explained and concluded all that went before. It was also his statement of faith, which expressed and endorsed all that he now was. But this moment was bigger than the patriarch. It looked forward to the climax of history itself, and it spoke of a faithfulness to come beyond any human comprehension. It was as though the sunlight which that moment glinted off Abraham's knife flashed through history from the beginning of time to the conclusion of time, all explained by a moment on this very spot, where a son committed his spirit to his father and the father sacrificed his son. But that time wasn't yet. And this was neither the son nor the father who could and would pay that sort of price. It was the briefest pause for breath, but was enough for a heavenly father to look down upon an earthly father, see his faith and fear, and love him. It was enough, too, for a heavenly son to look down from heaven, see Isaac, his faith and fear, and love him and want to save him. Like no other, this son understood. He knew his father's heart. The son had spoken it out in judgment over cities and in mercy over individuals. He'd foreknown and foretold the birth of Isaac, and he who stood with his Father eternal outside of history saw and understood this particular moment from the foundation of the world itself. He saw this moment as one which bisected time. All that went before was happening then and would happen after. He understood this moment not just as an objective observer might, but as one who would take the place of Isaac and become the sacrifice himself. And so the angel of the Lord called out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." It was, I suppose, a formal cry, but no less impassioned for that. It spoke with love, respect, and above all, understanding. Here I am, the Patriarch replied once more and breathed again. He didn't lower the knife, but nor did he plunge it into his son's heart. Instead he froze. He knew the voice. It was the one who'd spoken to him that day at Mamre and over the hills before Sodom and Gomorrah. When he spoke, his was the word of the Lord with the authority of his father. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the voice said. In relief, Abraham, still with eyes tight shut, slowly relaxed the grip on the knife and lowered his arm. He obeyed. He couldn't argue with the one who spoke to him, even if he wanted to. He spoke with authority and compassion. He spoke of Isaac tenderly, as though he was a child, even his child. Do not do anything to him. And finally Abraham's arm dropped to his side, and the knife fell from his hand. "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son." There was relief, but more, there was pleasure in the voice now, and yet there was still more. There was knowledge, even pain. Your only son. For the first time, Abraham opened his eyes and looked up. The voice of the Lord seemed to come directly from heaven. But Abraham had seen the Lord before and expected to see him now standing before him. However, this time, although he heard the Lord, he saw a ram. He was caught by the horns in a thicket. The shock set in quickly, although not before Abraham did what he had to do. First he went over to the ram and slit its throat. Then he came back and slit Isaac's ropes. Somehow Isaac slipped off the altar stunned. Like his father, he was still unable to process what had happened and what now was happening. Together they managed to place the ram on the wood and used the dying embers to light the pyre, and then they fell back to watch the spectacle, and it was then that they attempted to come to terms with the events of the morning. On one level it was so straightforward, just a moment in history like any other, and they lived it like any other in time and space. It may have felt unreal now as they sat before the pyre and thought about it, but it did actually happen. And yet on another level, it was a historic moment like none other, and they knew it. Accordingly, they struggled to know how to respond to it. Slowly, as the shock subsided and the numbness wore off, Abraham noticed he was shaking, and he couldn't stop. It was as though his body was complaining that it needed to do something but didn't know what to do. So he just sat with Isaac and shook. For hours they sat there in front of the sacrifice, watching the lamb burn. But as Abraham watched, slowly, very slowly, the truth became clearer. In faith, he had told his son that the Lord would provide, and he had. He had believed, and the Lord had provided. Somehow it was beginning to make sense, and from somewhere Abraham could feel a new emotion welling up inside him. He still shook, but where before he shook with shock, now he was shaking with a very different emotion. At first it appeared to be relief, but as it grew it was apparent it was more than this. It was joy, and no ordinary joy. It was a joy which was inexpressible beyond involuntary convulsions. And yet it was apparently contagious, as Isaac too became caught up in it. He laughed. Isaac couldn't help it. He laughed and laughed. Jehovah Jireh! Abraham said quietly to himself, "The Lord will provide." And then he looked at his son and repeated it louder, "Jehovah Jireh." And then he roared with laughter and shouted at the top of his voice, words which really did echo through the mountains, "The Lord will provide." There was nothing more to say, but nothing could stop their joy. They knew their God, their provider. They were watching his provision. Somehow for Abraham it was even more graphic and demonstrative than Isaac's conception and birth. This was the Lord's doing. And what therefore wouldn't he do? Without warning, the thought sobered Abraham, and he stopped laughing and looked once more at the remnants of the sacrifice. Isaac too caught the mood of his father, and as quickly as the joy had spread to him, it left him. Wonder replaced ecstasy. The question turned. He no longer asked, what wouldn't God do? Now he asked, what would he do? Just for a moment, the prophet was taken up to heaven and saw this place from there. And from there he found the answer to his question. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Oh, he had provided here, but would provide more, much more. Here it would happen. Quite what? He didn't know. But something in his spirit quickened, and he saw and believed. On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. It was now late in the day, and the sun was beginning to go down, but still father and son couldn't bear to leave this moment behind them and begin their descent. They stood in continued awe and wonder, and in this place the angel of the Lord spoke from heaven a second time to Abraham, this time more measured, a solemn vow. I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through their offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. The solemnity of the words marked the conclusion of the matter. It was finished, and there was nothing more to be said or done. Suddenly the place was a hillside again, and nothing more. It was darkening, and Abraham and Isaac needed to leave, and now could. They headed down in silence, one unaware of the words of the Lord to his father, the other unable to take on board any more. Just once on the path down to where his servants had set up camp, did Abraham ponder the words. The Canaanite city of Jabez was shutting down for the night. As the two strangers passed by in the lengthening shadows, they went largely unnoticed by people utterly unaware of all that had happened in the midst that day, let alone the dramatic implications of these events. But as Abraham skirted around the city, he couldn't resist asking himself the question, which of his descendants would take this city? And then he pondered that even this people, who he reviled more than any other, would apparently be blessed because of his actions today. The two servants who welcomed back their master and his son were equally in the dark about it all, but they neither sought nor needed any further explanation. Their fellow travellers were obviously tired, and they would need to rest in readiness for the journey home the next day. Consequently, they had prepared a fire and some food, and then while Abraham and Isaac ate, they prepared some beds for the night. But for all their tiredness, sleep didn't come easily to either Abraham or Isaac, and it finally only came as the sun began to set the following morning. The servants accordingly had another wait on their hands the next day, and the return to Bathsheba would take a while longer. But no one seemed to be in a hurry. There was little to go back to. For a moment, Abraham even thought of heading in a different direction entirely, towards Kiriath Arba. There was, after all, one living there who needed to hear of these things. More to the point, she was the one above all others he wanted to tell of these things. For a moment, a sense of urgency seemed to compel him, but then it passed, and he decided to head home as planned. He would visit Sarah soon, though, he resolved. But by then, it would be too late.
You're listening to Patriarch the podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support those working with young people across the world.